So let's carry on with our discussion of security and talk about protecting the network, or as I put it in the title, protecting the users from the scum of the network. So over the past few videos, we've talked about who wants to attack us and why they might want to attack us and how they might carry out those attacks. So how do we protect the users and our network infrastructure from these attacks? Now we'll talk about some specific methods you can use for securing various parts of the infrastructure, but it basically boils down to defense in depth. Basically, don't depend on just one layer of defense to protect the network. A lot of people will say, oh, well, I've got a firewall out in front of my network. That's going to be good enough. Well, what happens if someone happens to get past that firewall? Let's say they compromise a web server that sits behind that firewall. Now they have control over a web server that might be sitting right on the inside of your network, and they can use that as a platform to attack further inside your network, attack other machines, attack your network infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So you want to practice defense in depth. Basically, you protect the perimeter. You set up a firewall, you set up proxy servers and NAT and reverse proxy. And again, not going to go into a whole lot of detail on exactly how to set all of that up, but just know that you have to protect the perimeter. You have to protect your off-site connections, protect your internet connection. Make sure that you have a good, strong router out in front of your internet connection that could handle a potential DDoS. And maybe even use an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system to automatically blacklist certain IP addresses when they start behaving badly. You protect your workstations. You make sure that all of the software is up to date on your workstation, so that way if someone does happen to make it past the perimeter and make it past your internet connection, then it's going to be more difficult for them to find a foothold on your workstations because they're all patched and they're all running the latest version of the operating system patches and the application patches. And obviously you have to protect your servers. Make sure that they have all of the necessary patches. Make sure that they're configured to only allow connections to the other machines that they need to connect to. If you have a web server that has to talk to a database server, make sure that that database server only accepts connections from the web server and from whatever other administrative workstations you might need to manage that database server. So now let's talk about a few specifics. Step one will be firewalls. And a firewall in a computer networking context is much like the firewall in a car. It protects you from the engine, somewhere you don't really want to be, and it allows certain connections between the inside of the car, the steering wheel, the turn signal, the radio, and the engine compartment to control the way the car moves, to control the throttle in the engine, to control the electrical system. In a computer context, firewalls sit at the perimeter of the network, and they only allow specific connections to specific machines. We'll discuss exactly how that works, and I've got one of my patented diagrams here at the bottom of this slide. You'll see that in a few seconds, and it'll make a little more sense then. Firewalls can reduce the likelihood of access attack, because honestly, if they can't get into the network, then they can't try usernames and passwords. They can't run one of those network vulnerability scanning tools that we mentioned in the previous video. The next step is to set up what's called a DMZ, or a demilitarized zone. And once again, the computer world takes terms from the real world, if you will, and uses them in a networking context. A DMZ is just like it is between North and South Korea, at least as it is between North and South Korea as of late 2012. It's an area where no one really wants to go. It's an area that's not quite in the enemy territory, and it's not quite in our territory. It's kind of a middle ground where we can meet if we have to. Here's one of my patented diagrams that I just mentioned. So you have a machine out here on the internet, and it needs to access a server that's inside your network. Well, you could just allow a direct connection from this workstation on the internet to your server. And if this is a web server, they will attach to port 80. However, if this is a Windows web server, you probably are running lots of other protocols on this guy as well that would be exposed out to the internet if you just left it out there for all the world to connect to. A DMZ involves putting a firewall between this web server and any other machines that are inside this DMZ. Let's say that this web server has to talk to a database server. And so this database server can sit out in the DMZ, however, the firewall does not allow access to the database server. But let's say you have to have access to resources inside the network, and that's where the second half of the DMZ comes into play. You have another firewall that protects your internal network, and then these servers in the DMZ can talk to mainframes or other servers inside the network or to video conference systems. At least those are the examples that I have here. And obviously any traffic coming from inside your network, since it's coming from a more secure zone, can pass out right through both of these firewalls out to whatever hosts on the internet they need to access. And we're going to move on and talk about network protections. Now, we've talked about protecting the outside connections. This is a discussion of ways to protect the internal network infrastructure from any potential access or hacking attacks. Number one, make sure that everything on the network is running current antivirus. Again, that seems kind of like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised at the number of small networks that I walk into. And I'll log into a server, maybe their main file server, and hey, where's the antivirus? Oh yeah, we just never installed it on there. It slows the main file server down. It's like, I just want to take you and smack you around a little bit, because this is where everyone's putting their files. If someone puts a virus-infected file on your main file server, then everything on that server is potentially suspect. And again, it's not enough to just have antivirus installed. It needs to be updated because new threats emerge in the landscape all the time. And if you are running outdated antivirus definitions, then that's almost as bad as not running any at all. The next step is to enforce password security. And you'll recall when we talked about access attacks, we discussed a user that had forgotten their password and they're just trying every password. Well, I'll try this. Oh, I changed it. I'll try that. I'll try the other password. If you have proper password security, after the user tries to log in incorrectly 3 or 4 times, their user account will lock out and may send an email or may give some other indication to network management that, hey, this particular user account was locked out because of too many incorrect passwords. Now, it could just be a user that changed their password, went on a week vacation, and can't remember it when they come back. Or if it happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, it might be someone trying to log in using a bad password or an outdated password. Another method of enforcing password security is making sure that passwords change every so often. This way, if a user's password is compromised, it's only good for a certain number of days before they have to change it. The third step of enforcing password security is to make sure that they use complex passwords. Don't let people just use their username as their password, or the word password or password 123. Active Directory by default with Server 2008 and above requires complex passwords. It can't be the same password you used 2 passwords ago, and so on and so forth. The third step in protecting your network is to secure your routers and switches. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly how to secure routers and switches when we discuss routers and switches elsewhere in the course. But basically, just use some common sense. If you have a switch that's sitting out in an exposed location, disable any ports that aren't in use on that switch. If you have a router that is accessible to really anyone, secure that router. Use SSH. Make sure it has a good enable password. Make sure that it is running some type of network security on the device so people can't use your routers and your switches as part of a reconnaissance attack. And step 4 is physical security. And a lot of people overlook physical security, but there's an adage that someone who I respect a lot that works in security taught me a long time ago. And that adage is, if I have physical access, I win. If I can walk into your data center, pick up your server, and walk out and take it back to my bat cave so that I can hammer on it and try to crack the passwords, all of the security in the world on that box is not useful. Because yeah, you're out of server or you're out of laptop, and that's generally the biggest attack vector for physical security. But you know, someone steals my laptop and it's got a file on there that's got our IP scheme for our network, or it's got a list of network passwords for our network equipment. Any encryption can be broken, it just takes longer for some of the higher levels of encryption. But this is the one thing, if I can enforce or impress on you in some way, is make sure you have physical security. Also, educate your users about social engineering. Social engineering is part of the reconnaissance attacks that we talked about earlier in the course. But social engineering is calling up the help desk and saying, yeah, I'm here working on the CEO's computer and he's left the office and I need his password so I can unlock it and check it. Well, hopefully your help desk is intelligent enough to know, let me talk to the CEO, or let me call him on his cell phone to make sure that, he actually needs you to unlock his password. There was a news story just recently about a journalist who basically had his Twitter account and Facebook account hacked. They wiped his iPhone and his iPad and all of his devices, and they used social engineering. They basically called up Apple and pretended to be the user and said, yeah, I forgot my password. Here's the last 4 of my credit card number. Can you reset it? And then they logged in with that password that they just reset, changed the email address, and just all snowballed from there. You can go Google it up if you're interested. But your users need to be aware that sometimes if you see someone in the building and it doesn't look like they shouldn't be there, challenge them. Make sure that that's not someone that's just walking in trying to dig through garbage cans or look under keyboards for passwords. And finally, enforce physical security to sensitive areas. Don't let anyone just wander into your data center. Make sure that the access to your data center and your wiring closets is locked. Lock the door. Don't just leave the server rack just sitting out in the break room for anyone to walk by and plug up to. And again, to experienced network engineers, a lot of this is old hat, but to people that are just starting out, some people may not even think about physical security. Well, what good does it do them if they go take this router? Well, now if they can crack the password on that router, now they have your configuration, which may have WAN configuration information. You may have SNMP community strings. You may have local passwords on that router or that switch that they can then use as part of a reconnaissance or access attack against your network to try to gain more access than they should. And since they're the attacker, the access they should have is zero. So that concludes our discussion of protecting the network.